Good evening, good afternoon. So we are waiting 4 p.m. before starting. Ciao Daniele. Good afternoon. So as usually this live will be saved on our YouTube channel for those who cannot connect. Okay, we can start. Today is I have organized this live to introduce the new book by the Ophidian Synodus, which is the Introductory Treatise on Ophidian Doctrine, Theology of a Rational and Speculative Monotheism. This is a book that has been published in my name. I have written it this year, and it's basically vademecum to the Ophidian doctrine. So this presentation is structured in two different moments. In the first part of the presentation, I will introduce the book, its structure, and its topics. And then in the second part of the presentation, we will read a passage of the book that I think it's important, and we will comment it together. So I will always also answer to your question. So as I said, I published this book last month in June, and this is basically a re-edition of what was before, for the Ordo Damanti Satri, the treatise on Samalite doctrine. This time, in addition, of course, to the re-edition of the main topics, doctrinal topics that we also analyzed in the previous version of this book, I have added several parts, several sections, and several topics to the analysis. However, as you might understand from the title, this is just an introduction. As I said, it's a vademecum. So it's a presentation of the Ophidian doctrine, but it does not exhaust the discussion about the Ophidian doctrine. It just introduces the main topics and analyzes the main demonstrations that Ophidism adopts in its analysis of reality. This book has 11 chapters, and they are divided into 3 sections. The first section is called Historical Lineaments of Ophidism. So it's basically an historical introduction to Ophidism. And this section includes chapters as From the Sea Monster to the Dragon, an introductory philology of the serpent, which is a topic that we have vastly spoken about in the last live, but also in the papers that I have published through the Ophidian Synodus, analysis of serpentiformity in the Greek world, and Satan, serpent or empty name. So these are the 3 chapters that form the historical premises to Ophidism. That is the first section of the book. The second section of the book is instead formed by the Ophidian monotheism, an alternative to the intolerant monotheisms, introduction to Ophidian metaphysics, death and eschatology, and finally God and the world. So we have 4 chapters. And this second section is named Theoretical Premises to Ophidism. So basically the purpose of this second section is not giving anymore an historical description of the evolution of the symbolism of the serpent. Rather, it is to found the doctrinal discussion regarding Ophidism, and therefore, in this section, you don't only have an analysis of the difference between the polytheistic and the monotheistic approach, but also an in-depth analysis of the Ophidian metaphysics, and therefore to the concepts of pharmakon, polemos, neikos, and philia, and their relationship through a classical and philosophical approach. So with a gaze to the Greek philosophers such as Heraclitus, Democritus, Aristotle, and so on. Then you have a chapter about death and eschatology that gives you superficial perspective regarding what Ophidism believes the soul is and how the soul behave during life and after life. And then the chapter God and the World is also is interesting because it's a chapter that quotes Sartre, but also Heidegger, and therefore analyzes the idea of nothingness in the Ophidian liturgy, but also in the Western philosophy. And then we approach the third section of this book, that is the practical premises to Ophidism. And this is a more practical side, as you can understand from the title, speaking about the icon, the sacred icon, so the serpent in the Ophidian tradition, within the chapter, the image of God, but also in Short History of Liturgy, we define the evolution of the liturgical practice starting from the ritual and the magical ritual, more specifically within the Mediterranean area and in the Greek-Roman cultures. And then we approach the Ophidian liturgical practice with an analysis of the main sections of our canonica hiera, and therefore with a study on its symbolism and on its main elements. Finally, the section ends with an analysis of the Ophidian ethics, and therefore on those behaviors, but also on those premises that founds the Ophidian ethics. So I am speaking, for example, about the relationship between the individual and the collectivity or the states, and the behaviors that one should have within the Ophidian tradition. So as you can see, this is a very vast number of topics, starting from the philological analysis to the serpent and of the serpent and arriving to the ethics, but it surely serves at giving first, I don't want to say superficial, but for sure a first gaze at the Ophidian tradition. The book, once again, is available on Amazon worldwide, and the title again is Introductory Treatise on Ophidian Doctrine. You find it anyway directly in our website for purchasing. Now, this is more or less the structure of the book. What I want to do today is reading together a passage of the book and comment it briefly, so that you can understand how the book is structured, and which are the demonstrations and the reasonings that are brought into this text. I am at page 125 in the section called The Ophidian Monotheism, Demonstration and Critics. So this section is introduced in this chapter after a quite long analysis of an Ophidian philosophy. The chapter is the chapter 4, so the Ophidian monotheism, an alternative to the intolerant monotheism, in which Ophidism is described as a real, theoretical, and spiritual alternative to what is the typical and classical monotheism. So before reading the passage, I want to give some context, which is useful in our analysis. There is deep difference in the polytheistic and in the monotheistic approach. I have spoken about it many times in some of my temelia, so the philosophical discussions that are brought during the liturgy, but also in some publication. Where polytheism is more tolerant by definition, because it includes several deities and therefore does not have the definition of truth and falseness in the theoretical system, monotheisms do have this distinction. In particular, there is a speculation that I analyze in this chapter of the book, that is the speculation by Jan Assmann, who is an historian of religion. What Jan Assmann stated was that there is a specific point in the evolution of monotheisms in which these specific religious approaches became intolerant. And this point is called Mosaic distinction. So, the distinction of Moses. And this happens in the book of the Exodus, chapter 4, where God says to Moses that he is a jealous God. This is the moment, in Jan Assmann's opinion, in which the monotheism becomes intolerant because it introduces the distinction, the division between truth and falseness in the spiritual field. If on one side the polytheisms didn't have this distinction because one could venerate Dionysus and another one could venerate Apollo without any theoretical problem, without any theological problem, in monotheism, this possibility is not given. In monotheism, in the monotheistic approach, you venerate only one God, you believe in only one God, and it is precisely because there is only one God, then that you can deduct that all the other gods are false, and therefore all the other heretics must be destroyed. This is the Mosaic distinction suggested by Jan Assmann. So this chapter, the chapter 4, tries to explain not only why Ophidism is a monotheism, so not only why Ophidism believes in only one principle, but first and foremost, why Ophidism is not intolerant. So why Ophidism does not have the concept of Mosaic distinction. The first reason is quite obvious. We speak of Mosaic distinction because in the case of Christianity and Judaism, and partially also for the Islam, because we have a sacred text. It can be the Bible, it can be the Torah, it can be the Quran, but in those cases we have a sacred text. And the text is defined as sacred because it is revealed. These are texts that are written by the hands of God directly. It's God revealing himself to the devotees, to the community of the faithfuls. So what is problematic? It's not, as Jan Assmann said, only the idea of a Mosaic distinction, but, in my opinion, the idea of revelation. It is the idea of a God that reveals and that speaks directly to the community of the faithful that is problematic. for a monotheism. Now, as you might know, Ophidism does not have any kind of revelation. We do not believe in a God that manifests itself in the everyday life, or that speaks directly to the faithfuls, to the community of the faithfuls. So we don't have the entrance of the sacred into the profane, into the everyday life. And therefore, we don't have, as Jan Assmann said, the distinction between truth and falseness. We don't believe that by believing in one God only, we are entitled to assume that all the other gods are false, or that all the other believers are heretics. And the paragraph that I want to read and comment with you today is included precisely in this speculation. So, as I said before, this is the paragraph entitled The Ophidian Monotheism, Demonstration and Critics, and it's placed within the chapter 4, within the context of the analysis of an Ophidian philosophy, of the possibility of an Ophidian philosophy. So I start reading. Having constructed the premises of our theoretical framework, and this is what I was speaking about just now, we have finally arrived at the point of demonstrating the necessity of an Ophidian monotheism, laying down the final stones of our speculation. Thus far, we have outlined the primary differences between polytheism and monotheism, again, the Mosaic distinction and the possibility of the coexistence of more divinities. Defined our methodological approach and advanced structural criticism against the monotheistic model characterized by the so-called Mosaic distinction. However, we have not explained why Ophidism is, ipso facto, a monotheism. So why is Ophidism believing in only one principle, in only one deity? The necessity of identifying a single God, though not universally shared, is quite ancient. Conversely, the attempt to justify this choice through rational means is a more recent development. What here is stated is that, beside what we believe, as a matter of fact, monotheism is not a recent or a new invention. It's something that in various shapes and forms existed throughout all the history of religions. I am thinking, for example, at the Zoroastrianism, which is the most ancient monotheism, but also Judaism, although was not born as a monotheism but as a polytheism, had attempted already in its early stages a monolatry, so the veneration of only one of all the gods in which they were believing in. We also have the heresy of Akhenaton in ancient Egypt, when all the Egyptian pantheon was substituted with the sun god. So we have several manifestations of the monotheistic approach throughout the history of religion. But what it is new is the philosophical approach to these demonstrations. So a more rational demonstration of this idea. So how can we explain rationally or demonstrate rationally and philosophically that only one principle, that only one God exists? And this is the point of the chapter. The first thinker who sought to explain monotheism rationally was Aristotle, the originator of the argument of the prime mover, which is quite famous. In synthesis, the Stagirite, which is another way of calling Aristotle, argues that if it is true that every existing entity possesses a cause, then there must exist an uncaused entity termed the prime mover, which moves other things without being moved, in order to prevent an infinite regress. The argument of Aristotle was quite linear. By observing, the existence, we can see that every object has a cause, and that cause, on its turn, has another cause, and so on. The problem that Aristotle had in this demonstration is that by doing this, we finish to theorize reasoning ad libitum, which is to say, an infinite regressus, an infinite going back into this chain of causes without ever finding an end to the chain. And this was a problem for Aristotle. This very same argument was later adopted during the scholastic period by St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae. So, the scholastic period, as you might know, is the period of Christian philosophy following the foundation of the church, I would say the first hundreds of years after the acknowledgement of Christianity as the state religion in the Roman Empire. And St. Thomas Aquinas, who is maybe the greatest defender of the Christian faith in these centuries, but also one of the greatest philosophers at that time, reproposed Aristotle's argument in his Summa Theologia, which is the main book he wrote. And now I am quoting directly from the Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas. Regarding the unity of the divine essence, it must first be known that God exists. This is evident to reason, say Thomas Aquinas. For we see that all things subject to motion are moved by others. Here we have the Aristotle argument. If Aristotle spoke about causes, Aquinas spoke about motion, movement. Lower things are moved by higher ones. For instance, the elements are moved by celestial bodies, and among the elements, the stronger moves the weaker. Likewise, among celestial bodies, the lower receive motion from the higher. But it is impossible to proceed unto infinity in this manner. Again, Aquinas, as did Aristotle centuries before, states the impossibility of what in philosophy is called a regressus ad libitum, so a return to the infinite. It is not acceptable for these thinkers to proceed into an infinite causal chain of causes and effects. So there must be, by logic, a prime mover, so a cause that is not caused by any other cause, that moves all the other objects of existence. For since everything that is moved by another is in some way an instrument of a first mover, if there were no first agent, all things that move others would be mere instruments. Now, if this process of movers and moved were to go unto infinity, there would be no first mover. Hence, all infinite movers and moved would be instruments. Now, it appears ridiculous, even to the unlearned, to admit that instruments move without being moved by a principal agent. It would be like admitting that for the construction of a cabinet or a bed, the saw or the axe would suffice without the work of the carpenter. It is therefore necessary that there be a first mover above all things, and this we call God. So the argument brought by St. Thomas Aquinas does not stop in the demonstration that Aristotle brought up in the Metaphysics centuries before, because Aquinas tries also a reasoning by absurdum. So tries the inverse reasoning to demonstrate that his reasoning is correct. He says that since everything that is moved by another thing is an instrument of a first mover, if we do not acknowledge the existence of a first mover, all the other things would be instruments. Therefore, if we say this, so if we say there is no first mover and therefore all the other instruments moves by themselves, we are admitting that an axe that we use to cut the wood, for example, moves by itself and it's not moved by the hand of a man. This is a reasoning by absurdum, of course. In these pages, Thomas draws heavily from Aristotle's metaphysical speculation, reproposing the impossibility of an infinite regress within a chain of causes and effects. An interesting critique of this argument was advanced centuries later by the philosopher David Hume, who decided that an infinite regress is impossible. For Hume, the infinite is an absolutely acceptable mathematical and logical concept. Therefore, to reject a priori simply because it is difficult for the human mind to comprehend is nothing more than a logical fallacy. So the argument that is brought by David Hume centuries after what St. Thomas wrote is basically a question. And the question is, but who decided that this regressus ad libitum is not acceptable? Who decided that the idea of the infinite is not logical? So what Hume does is simply asking a question. And the question makes tremble all the logical building that Aristotle and Thomas built centuries before. Because Hume says infinity is a mathematical concept that we can totally introduce in metaphysics. And therefore, we can accept a reasoning that goes back to the infinity. We can accept a causal chain that has no end because the infinite exists. Hume also raises doubts regarding the very nature of the relationship between cause and effect. Indeed, for the author, the causal relationship is not a natural law, but a simple psychological habit of a man. We observe event A and event B, but we do not observe the actual relation that produces the second from the first. If this is true, then using causality to construct a chain of causes and effects that leads us directly to God is entirely unjustified. So the critique moved by Hume does not only stop at the introduction of the concept of infinity within this speculation, but also criticize the real idea of causality. What Hume says is that we as observer can observe an event A and an event B, but we cannot observe the true nature of their relationship. We cannot see, experience, witness that event B derives from event A. It might derive from event C, and event C might derive from event A, and event A might derive from event B. So this critique also criticizes the idea of a linear causality chain, not only the true idea of causality, that it's not something that we can observe at all. These latter 2 points are also fundamental to the thought of Immanuel Kant, who views causality as valid exclusively within the phenomenal world and not within the noumenal realm, which is subject to entirely different laws. For Kant, therefore, both Aristotle and Thomas committed a true logical leap, extending properties typical of the phenomenon to the noumenon. The critique that is moved by Kant as is of a different nature. It's not logical. It's not similar to what Hume did. It's rather, I would say, gnoseological or methodological. Kant says that the problem is not the idea of causality, not even the idea of a linear chain of causes and effects that brings us back to the idea of God. The problem is that we are extending phenomenal laws, so something that we can experience in our world, with something that regards or should regard the noumenal world. The noumenon is, in Kant's speculation, the ideal world, so what Plato called the world of ideas. I would say the metaphysical realm. So Kant says, methodologically, that what is wrong in this reasoning of Aristotle and St. Thomas is that is the method and not the reasoning in itself, which is valid for the phenomenal realm, the phenomenal world. Finally, so we have a logical critique, a methodological critique, and then we also have another critique that is moved by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. So, quoting the book, finally, a further critique of this classical argument is put forward by Bertrand Russell, who maintains that if it is true that everything must have a cause, then God too must have a cause. If, on the contrary, it is true that at least one uncaused thing can exist, then one might as well say that the world itself lacks a cause, without searching for an uncaused entity elsewhere. So, the critique moved by Bertrand Russell, similarly to what it was done by David Hume, is a logical critique. And what Russell does is reasoning in terms of absolute. Basically, he says that if we are trying to demonstrating the existence of God because we believe that there must be a cause that puts an end to this chain of causes and effects, then it's not necessary to go back to a divine object. We can stop at the existent world, at our universe. So if this is our need, it's not necessary at all to go this far away, metaphysically speaking. We can stop here. But if, on the contrary, we believe that everything must have a cause, then we need also to extend this reasoning to God, and therefore also God must have a cause. Now, this argument, in my opinion, has some fallacies, but I just reported it as it is written by Russell. Taken as a whole, these criticisms demonstrate that upholding classical proofs for the existence of God is today rather difficult, of course. On the other hand, rational and scientific thought have made considerable progress, and what was once sufficient to justify the existence of a deity may no longer be so. So basically, if 2000 years ago it was enough the demonstration of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, now, thanks to the evolution of science, philosophy, and rationality in a broader sense, this reasoning is not enough anymore. So we need something more. However, within a religious context, such as the Ophidian one, both these initial, yes, luckily, exactly. Within a religious context, such as the Ophidian one, both this initial demonstration and the criticisms leveled against it prove to be inconsistent. More accurately, if Ophidism was to view the world as a linear chain of causes and effects, its demonstration would inevitably collapse under the weight of the incontrovertible criticisms outlined above. Basically, so what I am stating is that if we were to use the Christian demonstration of the existence of God, we would collapse under these criticisms. So under the criticisms moved by David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Bertrand Russell, and many others. But we are not doing so. Yet, Ophidian monism does not rely on such a causal chain where God would merely be the first link. God, in Ophidism, of course, is not an external cause to the world, but is the world. God is its intrinsic reason, its ultimate horizon, the beginning and the end of all things. So, if we were to introduce the Christian reasoning once again, and therefore if we were to put God as the cause of all the effects that we witness in our lives, we would perish under these critiques. But in Ophidism, God is not a cause. It could be seen as a final cause, maybe, on an eschatological point of view, if we really want to use an Aristotelian term. But I would say that God is, in Ophidism, more similar to what Spinoza stated about God. God in Ophidism is very near to Spinoza's view of God, of the Deus sive natura, of the God within the nature. God is not a cause outside the world that starts a chain of effects from which we originate. God is the nature. God is the world. God is all the effects that we witness and that we experience. What these criticisms have succeeded in doing is not proving the non-existence of God, but rather demonstrating the impossibility of knowing God within a rigid and inflexible method, through logical and rational categories that do not belong to its field of inquiry. In this, Ophidism acknowledges the victory of the criticisms advanced by these authors. They are logical, so we cannot deny the criticisms by David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Russell to the existence of God as seen by Aristotle and Aquinas. But it also proposes to overcome them through an approach that, being anarchic, escapes rigidity by definition. Now, this last sentence might require clarification because it refers to another section of this same chapter in which I suggest to adopt what Paul Feyerabend, who is a philosopher of science, suggested as a methodological approach, which is the gnosiological anarchism. So this last sentence that I have just read being anarchic escapes rigidity by definition, refers precisely to this methodological approach that I suggest adopting. By refusing to confine the absolute within the frozen mummification of a prime mover, or within the shackles of a purely linear causality, the Synodus restores the divine to its legitimate horizon, that of perpetual flux, vital dynamism, and cosmic totality. All these words have been chosen for a reason. The word flux, of course, reminds us of the idea of polemos, so of that everlasting change that the Ophidian doctrine describes in light of Heraclitus' speculation about polemos. Vital dynamism refers instead to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the will of potency, so of a or will of life. So a will that always tends to overcome itself. This is the vital dynamism that I refer to in this passage. And finally, cosmic totality refers precisely to Spinoza, the Spinozian Deus sive natura. So we have Greek philosophers, and then we have such as Heraclitus, and then we have references also to Nietzsche and Spinoza. Ophidism thus erects its own anarchic monistic cataphatism, a path in which reason is no longer an excluding cage, but the supreme and free instrument to approach the infinite, wise, and divine coils of the source. So, anarchic monistic cataphatism. It seems complicated, but in reality it is not. Anarchic refers precisely to the speculation that I referred to before. So Paul Feyerabend's idea that knowledge, that true rational and scientific knowledge must be anarchic by definition, so must escape any possible dogma, any possible scheme. Monistic, of course, refers to the fact that Ophidism is a monism, so it's a philosophy that identifies only one principle, only one deity. And cataphatism seems a bad word, but it's not. It comes from the Greek kataphone, a word above. It means, and it's opposed to apophatism. So if on one side, apophatism, which is the approach adopted, for example, by the Orthodox speculation, refuses any speech about the deity, any possible analysis of the deity in order to avoid any mistake in defining what the deity is, the cataphatism is the opposite approach, and so is the philosophical inquiry on the deity. So the Ophidian approach that is defined in this paragraph is anarchic, so free, monistic, so that refers to only one principle, cataphatism, so philosophical inquiry. The philosophical approach of Ophidism is therefore free of dogmas, free of any possible scheme, refers to only one principle, which is the pharmakon, and does not avoid discussion, but rather it looks for the inquiry, for the discussion, for the confrontation, because it is not afraid to define what the divine is, what the deity is. It does not segregate itself in the silence because it is afraid of giving back a wrong image of what the divine is, of what the deity is. So the reason that as a faculty of the human being is not a cage in Ophidism, is not something as it happened throughout, I would say, all the first centuries of the Christian church, something that it's opposed to faith. We, especially those who will watch this video from a Western country, we are used to think about an opposition between rationality and faith, between the realm of science, philosophy, and etc., and the field of spirituality. But this is an something that we inherit from Christianity. This is not something um, that we should continuing adopting nowadays. Rather, reason, so it's not longer a cage, it's not longer something opposed to spirituality, but is precisely that instrument that we can use to approach the infinite, to make an attempt in defining what the infinite is, which are its main features, and on which basis we should build our own spirituality, our own relationship with the source. So as you can see, as you can deduct from this paragraph, Ophidism is quite a philosophical religion, and it is precisely because the subtitle of this book is Apology, so defense of a rational, based on reason, speculative, so philosophical, monotheism, so spirituality that refers to only one being, to only one object. So the chapter ends with these words, with this analysis, and then if you are interested in reading more, you can purchase the book on Amazon worldwide. If you are a member of the Synodus, you can request it for free as a PDF. That's it for today. So thank you for participating, to those who participated. I will save this video for our YouTube channel for other people to see it. Thank you very much, and see you to the next lesson. Bye bye.